Hey Crafty Friends, it's Laura, welcome back. As you can see from the title, today I am going to be sharing 10 watercolor tips for card makers. Now I am by no means a watercolor expert, however I do like to use watercolor in my card making, so I wanted to share with you some of the tips and tricks that I've learned along the way, and hopefully some of them are new to you and you can take those away and incorporate them in your card making. Okay, so the products that I'm going to be using to demonstrate all of these tips are actually the Arteza or Arteza Woodless watercolor pencils. Arteza actually make the craft mat that you see in the background of almost all of my videos, this grey gridded craft mat that's in the background there. And I wanted to grab these pencils. I've been seeing them online a lot, and it really kind of intrigued me that they were woodless, so kind of everything that's in there is the pigment. And they come in a pack of 24 that is a little bit difficult to open. I had to go ahead and grab my scissors and trim all the way around this plastic packaging to be able to get them out. But then once you actually take them out, they're in these nice little holders. You could definitely have kept them in there, but I decided that I wanted to decant them just into a small pot. It's how I like to keep most of my colouring medium, just so it'd be a little bit handier to grab and to use. So one thing that I was concerned about with these pencils is that I would activate the pigment on the outside of the pencils in error, I guess just because my hands were a bit wet or from the oils from my hands, but they are actually coated in a lacquer, so they are nice and clean to work with, which was a pleasant surprise. So the other item that I'm using is the watercolor pad. I actually got these in a 2-pack. There's 32 sheets. It's really nice and thick, and it has one side that is smoother and one that has a little bit more texture, and it's actually a really nice bright white. So this piece that I have here is my normal card panels. It's my Nina Solar White, and you can see that it actually matches up quite nicely. They are of a similar tone. So with that said, let's jump into tip 1. This one is possibly quite obvious to a lot of you, but if you are new to watercoloring, then this one is so very useful. You want to make sure you use a compatible ink. So I have Memento Tuxedo Black at the top here, and you can see how much that black ink is smudging. But then when I have VersaFine, which is my favourite for working with watercolour, don't mind Dexter's toes in the background, um, it doesn't smudge at all, and that is because it's compatible with watercolour. If you have a look at the back of your ink pads, there is usually some information on there which tells you whether or not it's suitable for alcohol markers, whether or not it's light fast, meaning it won't fade over time, and whether or not it's compatible with watercolour. Now, if you don't want to have to worry about any of that, you can grab something like a Gina K amalgam ink, and that will work with everything. It works with water, it works with alcohol markers, and the only reason I didn't use it in this video is because mine needs re-inking. As for the paper, I would definitely recommend a nice thick watercolor paper like the one that I'm using in all of these examples here, and I'll talk a little bit more about the paper as I go through the rest of the tips. Okay, so let's move into tip number 2. This is a really fun one, and this is how to add texture. So there's a couple different ways that you can do this. I'm going to show just some basic watercolor wash and then 2 different ways to add texture. And I'm actually using the rough side of the cardstock. So I mentioned that this particular one has a smooth side and a more textured side. Whenever you look at watercolor paper, it may advertise itself as cold press or hot press. If you think of hot press as like an iron, so it's smoothing out all of those wrinkles, that's kind of my kind of very, very childish way of remembering exactly what the difference is between hot and cold press. Having smooth watercolor cardstock is useful for things like stamping, so as a card maker that's great for me. And I really like having the option of both sides. So I'm working on the textured side for this piece because I'm going to want to add some texture to this. And all I'm doing is creating a very, very simple watercolor wash. I scribbled down 3 different colors going from dark to light. And then I'm just picking up a brush with clean water each time and just helping to blend that out. So before it dries, I'm going to go ahead and add some cling film or saran wrap if you're in the States, and I'm just going to kind of smush that up over the wet section on the far right. And then in the middle section, I'm going to grab regular household salt and sprinkle that into the middle section. I got a couple extra pieces where I didn't want them, so I tried to pick those up. So you just want to leave this to dry overnight and then come back. You can see here the colours have kind of softened down as they've dried, but then I'll brush away any of that excess salt and you can really see where that texture is left behind on your watercolour painting or your watercolour wash as this is. So then if we remove the cling film, we'll also be able to see some little kind of lines wherever those creases were. It doesn't show up the best on camera, and I have to say, I do think that this technique works better with a really thick layer of watercolour paint. However, it is another trick to have up your sleeve for adding texture. So now for tip number 3, we're going to talk about heat embossing. Heat embossing and watercolour go together so very well. I'm going to grab this large peony from a stamp set from the Ton. All of the supplies that I'm using are linked in the description below if you want any more information about them. And I'm inking up with my VersaFine ONYX black ink, and then I'm actually going to use a clear embossing powder over the top. I prefer this to using a black embossing powder because black embossing powder has a mind of its own, it goes everywhere. But you could definitely use whatever colour you want. You could coordinate with the colours that you're going to colour in the peony image. You could use a coloured embossing powder and a clear ink. Whatever you have that works for you, you just want to make sure you heat set that image. And then we will be able to go and colour. So why do you need this tip in your life? Each of those sections of the image will contain the water that you add, and the reason being that your heat embossing is slightly raised off the surface of the cardstock, so when you add the water it will sit in there like a little puddle inside of a well. It won't spill out over to the next section and make a whole big mess, and it's just a really nice way to contain everything. So heat emboss your images, and honestly, it will change your watercolouring. Of course, if you flood the area with a whole load of water, it will spill out over the side. Those raised edges aren't that high, but it will definitely help gain some control over your watercolour. So I've just gone ahead and skipped forwards to the end so you can see that final finished image, and then we'll move into tip 4. So for this one, I wanted to talk about how you can tip your work surface to allow the water to do the work for you, which who doesn't love someone else doing the work for you? So I grabbed this Taylor Expression stamp set, and this is so beautiful. I love all these coloured pencils, and I thought it'd be a great opportunity to work with a whole bunch of the colours from the Arteza set. So I'm just scribbling the colours onto the top sections and just working in a rainbow order because, of course, rainbow. And I'll go ahead and add a bunch of colour to the top section to each of these, and then I'm going to go ahead and grab my water brush. I believe for this one I actually switch between using a water brush and a paintbrush. There is no kind of tips or hacks there, it's just sometimes I prefer working with a water brush, sometimes a paintbrush, usually it's whatever's closest and I happen to go ahead and grab. So I've added all the colour to the actual end of the pencil and the barrel, and then I'm just colouring that wood section. And then here I've just grabbed a little trinket dish and I'm going to balance this piece on top of it. I've actually taped down my cardstock to an old scrap of cardboard. I think it was from maybe like a file folder or something, but you could use a clipboard or whatever you have. You just want to angle the piece that you're working on. So you'll see here as I add the water, I'm testing a couple different methods. Sometimes I start at the top and add the water and then drag the water down. Sometimes I actually wet the bottom section first and then go ahead and pull the colour up to the top. One thing that I do know from working with watercolour, there's not a ton I know, as I say, these are the tips that I've picked up that have helped me. The watercolour will not run where the paper is dry. Within reason, depending on how much water you add and how crazy you go. So if you want your colour to blend, you want to make sure that the paper is wet, either before you introduce the colour or after you introduce the colour. And having the surface that you're working on tilted is going to allow gravity to help pull that colour down and allow that soft blend to happen, which is one of the greatest things about watercolour, that really soft look. So as I've worked my way across colouring these in, you'll see that some of them blend a little more easily than others. That was just something that I found in particular with the green. It tended to kind of stick. It may have been user error on my part, but just a comment if you're looking to get your hands on these woodless watercolours. I did find that some of the colours were a little more difficult to blend out, but on the most part they all blend really beautifully. So you probably noticed as I was working through this that I skipped every other pencil, and that is actually my next tip to avoid working on side-by-side sections. So we have a lot of water at play here and a lot of different colours that want to mix and they want to join each other wherever that water meets. So we know that we can control this a little bit by embossing our image because it gives us some little ridges, some little sides to help contain the chaos. And if we work on sections that aren't touching each other, so we keep the paper dry in between the wet sections, then there is much less chance of cross-contamination and mud. Mud is definitely the enemy. It is so very easy for your colours to blend in a way that you don't want them to and to create a muddy effect, and this is definitely a way to help contain that. This can also help if you want to save an area of your image and keep it really bright and white, then you don't want to have any water in that section because the colour will run in there and muddy everything up. As a bonus tip, if you want to avoid mud, definitely be aware of the colour wheel. You can look it up if you're not aware already, but it will definitely help you avoid mixing colours that are going to create brown. So I've gone ahead and skipped towards the end of this piece, and I'll actually go ahead and show you how I turned this into a card. I just trimmed this piece down and added a black die cut sentiment from Brutus Monroe to make a cute little hello card. Tip 6 is possibly one of my favourites. I have two variations of how to stamp with watercolours. So for this first one, I've grabbed my large Taylor Expressions butterfly stamp, and I have that in my MISTI with some watercolour paper right there on the right hand side, and I've just generously sprayed the image with water. That's it, just water, nothing else, and I'm going to go ahead and gently colour over the top of the image. I'm being sure not to apply a bunch of pressure. I'm just rubbing the pencil over the top of that stamp design, and wherever it's got those raised edges, it will pick up the pigment, and the pigment will be activated by the water, allowing me to transfer that into a stamp. And this is such a fun technique. You're going to love the result that this gives. Now I will say that I think you get a better result using a deeply etched red rubber stamp compared to using a photopolymer clear stamp. However, it will work with both, and I definitely think the MISTI is useful to have for this technique. But you can do this just using an acrylic block in the exact same way. You'd go ahead and mount the stamp on your acrylic block, spray it with some water, colour over the top, and then just press down onto your cardstock. As I go ahead and do the stamping here, you'll notice that I actually hold the image in place for a few seconds. Because this is watercolour rather than an ink which is designed for stamping, you've got to give it a little bit of extra help. And I find that all you need to do is hold the image in place for a few seconds and allow the paper to absorb that colour, and then wait until you see. This looks incredible. Look how beautiful that is. That is the most stunning butterfly that I could never imagine painting, and I'm actually going to get 2 for 1. So here's the second part of this technique. The first one we did was wet to dry. This one's going to be wet to wet. So I've gone ahead and soaked that paper, and then I'm stamping down that same butterfly just using the excess pigment that's on there. You could go ahead and colour it up again if you want a more extreme result. And again, holding it in place for a few seconds, and look at that. Is that not the most beautiful technique you've ever seen? Maybe I'm getting a little overexcited and carried away. However, I've let both of those pieces dry, and I'm actually going to use the loose watercolour, so that second one, to show you tip 7. Tip 7 is to do your stamping, or in this case, heat embossing, just because I had all the tools out on my desk and that was what I felt like doing, to clean up an image. Now this butterfly looks beautiful, that really loose watercolour feel to it. However, if you go ahead and stamp, look how it brings that image back to life. And you could do this with flowers or any image. You could create a really loose watercolor and then go ahead and stamp over the top to create that detail back into the image, and it gives such a beautiful effect. So I turned both of those pieces into cards just by trimming them down and adding a hugs die from Birch Press Designs. So here we go with tip number 8. And again, this is going to be another 2 for 1. So I've grabbed an empty mist bottle and I'm using a pencil sharpener just to scrape away some of that pigment from this pencil. With it being woodless, it's so easy to do because everything that comes off is pigment, so I don't have to kind of fish out pieces of the pencil. Or you could do this with your liquid watercolor. You want to add some of the pigment to an empty bottle and then top that up with water and give it a good shake, and you have just created a DIY mist spray that will perfectly match your watercolor paints. So now to use the mister, I've grabbed a Gina floral stencil and I'm just generously spraying over the top of that. I have it taped down over the top of some watercolor cardstock, and then I'm just peeling away that masking tape. I did find with this particular masking tape, it would peel away parts of the paper. It doesn't usually with some of my other papers, so that may be something to be careful of with this Arteza paper. But if you just cut it a little bigger than the design you want to use, then it will be absolutely fine. So whilst I was explaining that, I was adding some Perfect Pearl, which is a beautiful, I believe it's mica-based powder. And I added that in, gave it a good shake, and then spritzed, and you can see how that adds some shine to the watercolor. So again, I went and turned both of these into cards, and I finished them up just using a stamp from Gina Designs and also some black peel-offs from Love from Lizzie. So tip 9 is possibly the easiest of all the tips that I'm going to have shown you today, and this is creating an on-the-go watercolor palette. So easy to do. You just want to grab some of your watercolor paper, make sure it's really thick and sturdy, and then scribble down any of those colors that you want to take with you. I'm working through the majority of the colors and just adding a little swatch onto this paper. And I'll go ahead and skip ahead so you don't have to watch the whole thing. But then the magic is you can pop this in your bag and take it away with you, and whenever you add water, which is super easy if you're using a water brush pen because you already have your paintbrush and your water good to go, you can then reactivate those pigments, or activate them I guess because they haven't been activated yet, and then paint with them on the go. So you could have a bunch of these images stamped out, ready to take with you, and then just grab this watercolor palette and you really are, it's that simple. You do want to be careful with the amount of water that you add. You'll see with the very first one, that pink, it was super light because I added a bunch of water to it. But it works really nice and easily, and it's so easy to do. Now, this will not work with every single watercolor pencil. I've tried this with other pencils in the past and it hasn't worked, but it works beautifully with these ones. So we are down to our final tip. This is tip 10, and this is a whiteout or blackout technique. So it's another twofer. And I'm also going to just give one small bonus tip, which is to work in layers. Super important when you're working with watercolor to work in layers. You want to dry off the piece in between layers, and you'll see as I work through this little rainbow swatch here, what a difference that makes. So I'm just using my hand to tilt this piece. It gives me a little extra control, and that was one of the tips we talked about earlier and how that's going to help the water create the blending for me. So I'm activating each of those pigments and smoothing them out, and I mean that yellow looks so bright and beautiful, but then again I had a little bit of trouble blending out the green. So I didn't panic. I thought, okay, we can fix this. So I carried on blending and got all the way to the bottom of this piece. And then I actually dried the whole thing off and added a second layer. So I'm going over it again with clean water. This time I decided to work from the opposite end. There's no real rhyme or reason to that. And you'll see that I got more intense colour, and I was also able to blend out that green just a little bit more because there was a thicker layer on top to kind of hide those pencil lines. So I went through and did that one more time, and then I was ready to start the whiteout and blackout techniques. So those pieces are completely dry and I've trimmed it in half so I have two sections to work with. And I'm grabbing this large stamp from Brutus Monroe and I'm going to go ahead and ink this up with VersaFine clear ink. I did go ahead and prep this piece with anti-static powder tool, which is really important when working with embossing powder to make sure it doesn't stick to areas that you don't want it to. With hindsight, I should have stamped this a couple times. It's a really large stamp and I am stamping on watercolor paper, and whilst it might be smooth, it's never going to be quite as smooth as something like a Nina Solar White. So you'll notice in the samples at the end there are a couple areas where the embossing powder has skipped. So I grabbed the next piece and I'm going to go and do the same thing, just pop that into the MISTI and ink it up and then press that down. So now I have two pieces with a sticky copy of that image, and I'm going to go ahead and use those to add clear embossing powder to both. So once both of those images are good and melted, we are ready to start, and I'm going to do the whiteout technique first. This one is so simple. You just want to really saturate your cardstock. I've taped it down to help prevent some of the warping. You want to saturate it with plain and simple, just water, and then use a cloth to pick up any of that water. So nothing too much happened on this first pass, let's be honest. So I went through and did it again a couple times, and I'm just allowing that water to sit there for a little bit longer this time, just to really wake up that pigment, and then I'll use the cloth to pick up the excess. And I also kind of brushed it a little bit, and you're starting to see now that the pigment is coming away, but underneath that clear embossing powder, it is trapped and it is being kept at its original colour. Again, you will find different results based on the different types of watercolour that you use. Some will actually stain the paper and they won't lift at all. Some will lift really easily, much easier than this one is. With a little bit of patience and a little bit of encouragement, I got some really great results for that whiteout. Now, the opposite technique is a blackout. So I've grabbed a dark ink pad. I'm using a Distress ink pad. This is Black Soot, and I'm really covering that whole piece with this ink. Of course, this is sped up, so I'm not being quite as aggressive as it looks like I am. And I'm just swiping that all over the surface. Anywhere where that clear embossing sits is going to resist the ink. Some of it will sit on the surface, and you can go ahead and use a clean cloth just to buff away any of that excess ink. And you'll see that I did that here just to kind of clean up the image. And it was at this point that I noticed that some of the areas hadn't embossed quite as well as I would have liked them to, but I still think this looks really great. It almost gives the watercolor a glowing kind of a vibe to it. This reminds me of the types of plants that you would see in Avatar. So I let each of those pieces dry, and then this is what they looked like. Again, I turned them into cards. I finished off using the sentiment that was included in the Brutus Monroe stamp set and just stamped down using black ink on one card and white heat embossing on the other. So that is all 10 tips. There's a couple bonuses thrown in there. Thank you so much for sticking with me till the end of this longer video. I do hope that you enjoyed it. If you're new here, then you can go ahead and click on the logo on screen right now to subscribe and let me know in the comments which one is your favorite tip. That's all for me today. I hope to see you again soon. Bye for now.